Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this week we have Asura the Striker. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Leftover, Asura the Striker released for the PC via Steam in April of 2025. The easiest way to describe this title is a modern-day take on Space Harrier. So this one is an easy recommend, especially if you're a fan of rail shooters like Space Harrier or other titles along those lines. It also has some great value to it. There are a ton of stages that are presented in a Darius-style branching path, so if you like that kind of gameplay as well, then that's yet another reason to check this one out. But you don't just have to take my word for it. There is a demo available on Steam, so if you like what you see here, I highly encourage you to check out that demo, and you can make up your mind if this is a title for you. It also has a really good price point, so I feel the value is also definitely there. With all that said, we find ourselves at the main menu. So when you go to start the game, we're taken to the screen here where you can select between normal and easy. The instructions do have a brief description of the differences between them. The gist is that if you're on normal, you'll take damage from hitting obstacles. On easy, you won't. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, we have the practice mode. In practice, you'll be able to play any of the stages that you've unlocked in this branching path. So that's definitely something that can be a lot of fun if you enjoy, once again, that style of branching path. Now, starting the game, we will be playing it on easy, just so we have an easier time of talking about the gameplay. Beginning the game, we have a brief launch sequence where we see our character Asura take off to fight the alien force that we're having to battle to save the planet Earth. The gameplay here is really standard rail shooter, so we have a third-person view of our character and we can move around the screen. One thing to note, the game does have an option for how your neutral behavior, so if you let go of the controller, how that handles. You have the ability to either have it return back to the center of the screen, or you can have it stay where you've left your controller. So this is the default behavior, returning to the center of the screen. So as far as our attack options are concerned, Asura has two attack options. We have our energy shot, the long-range attack that we're using here, and we also have a short-range attack, which we can go and charge up. It's basically a charged punch. However, the thing with the charged punch is it's actually quite difficult to use. You have to wait for the right opportunity. Basically when enemies, or bosses in particular, are right in front of you. So the timing for using your knuckle is really tight. There's also an additional ability that we have to us, so that at the bottom of the screen you see that there's a meter called the Lightning Overdrive. So the Lightning Overdrive meter will ultimately allow us to use basically a slowdown mechanic. If you activate that, you'll see the screen has like lightning flicker, and then we're actually slowing down time. It's not as easy to go and see that when there aren't enemies or enemy shots in particular on the screen, but that's one way that we can both dodge enemy attacks and potentially set up really good hits with our close range fist attack. So the game itself has a lot of great opportunities for scoring, making it kind of a fun one to play through in score attack, in addition to playing through all the stages. So as I mentioned, there's branching paths, and another compelling reason to play through those is each of ultimately the ending stages for that branching path have a different ending. But as far as the scores are concerned, back to that, so the enemies will show up in waves. If we complete a full wave of the enemies, then we're awarded with a bonus. So it starts at 1,000, and then for every single wave we complete, it increases throughout the course of our run. So 2,000, 3,000, etc. And every single time that we hit a 10,000 mark, then we also earn an extend, basically a 1-up. So that's one way you can continue your run and ultimately target something like 1cc clear, if that's your goal for the game itself. The game does have 5 credits by default, so that's something to keep in mind. If you use all your credits, it will be game over. So now we found ourselves fighting our first boss, and if you are familiar with Space Harrier, this boss is going to be very familiar to you. So it's this dragon here, which one thing that's kind of tricky about it is it starts at the very back of the screen, and our shots do take a while to travel all the way back there. In addition to that, they're also fire kind of in a burst pattern, so you do have to be careful when you're firing. So the most important thing with this boss is it's a good opportunity to learn both how to use our slowdown and our punch. If you punch the boss, then it'll take damage, and for each successful punch that you get in, you also earn bonus points, starting at 1,000, and then it climbs up. However, unlike the enemy waves, which those will accumulate throughout the course of your run, our punch bonuses will ultimately reset for every single stage that we play. So one thing I also haven't touched on yet, that we'll go and see when we get to the results screen for this stage, it's possible to do the game as a pacifist run. So you can potentially play the game without ever attacking the enemies, and you will get bonus points at the end of the stage for having done so. The bosses themselves ultimately time out, and some of the bosses will time out faster than others. The boss fights are actually one of the things I really enjoy about this, as they're pretty standard for this style of rail shooter. However, one thing to note about these boss fights is that, especially later in the game, it becomes a little trickier to figure out exactly how you're supposed to fight the bosses. So it's a really careful combination of where you need to shoot versus when you also have to go and use the knuckle attack. Another successful punch and a couple shots, and that's first boss down. So now that we've completed the boss fight, we see that we have a brief moment where we have the results of our screen come up. So you're given points for your remaining shield, so you have one shield will go and equal one hit. If you run out of hits, then that's going to be it for your current continue, and then at that point you can continue if you still have credits, or game over if you no longer have credits. You also get bonus points for Knuckles, times running on the ground, as well as the number of enemies we defeated. And then there's also that option at the bottom for Pacifist, and you get a rank based off how well you did for the stage. Then after that, we're taken to this screen here where we can choose our next stage. So we can choose B or C, and depending on which stage we take, we'll be able to go and choose the two stages above that. So you have a branching path moving through there, ultimately getting to the end where you have the different endings that are available. And there's 7 endings there, as well as an Omega stage that shows up when you've completed the game. Now, when you do complete a stage, you also get an additional shield extend, thus allowing you to take even more hits. So I chose the night stage for a couple different reasons, because I really like the way that this cityscape looks, but also because it's just an easier stage overall than our stage, the other stage that we could take, the wilderness. And we have some really easy enemy waves to take out, thus allowing us to get even yet another extent. So that's really what we're wanting to do, is you want to be careful about taking out the waves as best as possible so you can continue stacking up extra lives. Also, if you get good with your timing, we can go do things like this and use the shiny knuckle to get some combo on enemies, thus being able to complete waves even more efficiently. So the enemies themselves definitely are very reminiscent of something you would see in Space Harrier. In fact, it seems like they're just like this developer's take on the enemies from said title. But one thing that I was initially incorrect about my thoughts on the game is that it seemed like the game didn't have much variety to the enemies outside of the bosses. but the more I've played through some of the stages and going down some of the branching paths that I hadn't been before, the more I'm seeing that there's actually more to the enemy variation than what we see here in just the first few stages. So it makes it even more worth it to kind of explore what the game has to offer. And with all that said, the boss fights do have a fair bit of variety. So you have the dragon in the beginning, we also have mechs that we fight, battleships, there's even a sandworm that we fight like later in the game. And as I was mentioning, some of the bosses are a little tricky to figure out how to properly attack them. The sandworm is definitely one that I encountered that for. So now we've seen the first time that I've taken damage in the game. When your character takes damage, they'll be shot back and kind of flattened against the screen itself. So it's a little bit of a jarring effect, and you don't want to necessarily see your character get beat up like that, so incentive for doing better, I guess. And with that, that's Asura the Striker served up for your enjoyment. So as far as the minus flavors are concerned, this isn't something I haven't talked about much yet, but for our gameplay purposes today, we're playing it on a Steam Deck, and the performance overall, while is definitely like more than adequate for most of the stages, there are some where the Steam Deck in particular does struggle, and we see some really reduced frame rates. So there, for example, there's one where you're fighting inside the cloud, so that whole like smoky stage atmosphere that the gameplay has is like really lowers your frame rate to something that's a bit harder to swallow. So that's my biggest minus flavor, is just the performance issues. Hopefully with some optimization and some tweaking, that won't be as big of an issue. Fighting our next boss here. So one thing to note about this boss is it does have additional enemies circling around it, so it's possible that you can get multiple enemies in one shiny knuckle if you happen to be lucky. Another potential minus flavor is, for some people at least, not necessarily for myself, but the gameplay is like a straight style of rail shooter, especially the Space Harrier style. So if you don't like this kind of gameplay, then maybe having those branching paths and all the different ways the stages you'd be playing through in the game to get all the endings might not be worth it for you. So that's something to potentially keep in mind if this title isn't necessarily your jam. But on the plus flavors, so I love this right here, the number of stages that the game has to it. Since you've got 28 stages just right there with the whole branching paths, that's a really big draw for me for this kind of a game. In addition to that, you also have all the multiple endings, providing even more potential replayability. And then one of the things that I really appreciate about the title is that they really nailed that classic arcade feel. So if you like this kind of gameplay, then they did an excellent job of capturing that feeling, but also giving us some new elements as well. Things like, I'm not 100% sure why I took damage there when I did go and destroy the wall, but anyway, things like using the mechanics like the punch there for taking out these rock walls. We can also use like the time slowdown to slow things down, charge up our punch, and bam, that's better that time. And also, with all that said, I also feel the game is a really good value for the amount of content it has in it. So at the end of the day, Asura the Striker is a solid recommend from the chef. And with that, we find ourselves at the end of this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, we want to thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful week yourself, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.